Hi, I'm Josh Silverman. I brought a fun project to Flaming Guy this past summer, and here's its story. Shogyo Mujo, try to say that 5 times fast, was the most successful sculpture project ever to be funded on Kickstarter. And it garnered quite a bit of attention in the months leading up to Burning Man. So how did I get involved? Well, Bart Kreza, the content designer for the project, came to my boss, Josh Weisberg, and showed him some of these mock-ups. Said, we're going to build a 30-foot tall faceted skull. We're going to build it out on the playa and see how it goes. Do you want to get involved? We need a lot of projection. And my boss said, yeah, that sounds great. He called me, asked if I would lead the projection team. I said, is that a serious question? Of course I would. And they sent me out, and that's how it went. So we were extremely mindful on the playa of the general ban on any kind of corporate sponsorship or messaging of that kind of thing on the playa. But today, we are not on the playa. Projection for this project was provided by the WorldStage lab. I'm the director of technology, and this was my project. But actually, thank you. Actually, it was a team of 3 distinct teams were involved in this. It was my projection team from the lab. It was Bart Kreza and his team. They did all the content for the thing. And then Joshua Harker, who was responsible for the design of the skull and its fabrication and everything that went along with that fabrication. More on that soon. So, how did this all go down? Well, excuse me. We started outside of LA in our warehouse where we loaded up 2 trucks, a 16-footer and a 26-footer at our WorldStage warehouse. I drove the 16-footer. I only crashed it twice. We drove to Reno, and we lost some tire treads along the way. It's still there on Route 80 somewhere. But we finally got out to the playa. We built some scaffolding. We dug some trenches for the cable. I had never understood quite how that was done, but as you can see, they have this giant fucking chainsaw thing that digs the trenches. It's really breathtaking to behold. So we dug all the trenches. And then we set some ground anchors. Now, I had never understood how this was done either, but I'm going to show you. You call up the artery, and they send out a pile of these anchors. They're about 1 meter long. And you flag out where you need the anchors. And then they send this giant drill thing to drill the anchors into the ground. Also quite breathtaking. Here it is. This is what it looks like. And it's actually a lot louder than this. Anyway, that's what you end up with. And it holds a couple thousand pounds. So we put in 24 of those for our 4 scaffolding towers and set some guy lines, took off our clothes, as you can see, and then we moved on to deal with the projectors. So we loaded the projectors into their enclosures inside of our trucks in the darkness, like that. This was done to keep the dust down inside of the enclosures. It worked pretty well. This picture was not taken on our truck. This is a guy in a coal mine, but it basically looked like that. Then we strapped the projectors onto platforms, as you see here in the bottom right, and forked them in pairs up onto the scaffolding. And up and down, and then we strapped them down with ratchet straps. So, that's what we ended up with. We laid some cables, we filled in the trenches, we put cladding around the scaffolding that's about 8 feet high to prevent people from climbing the scaffolding, as people are wont to do out there. Actually, this was not a problem for us at all. And added some safety lighting. We have a sealed, climate-controlled rack enclosure that we forked off the truck, dropped onto the ground in our control area, next to the beer fridge. That is a beer keg there by the beer fridge. Very important for productivity. That is not my mouse pointer. I don't know why it's in this photo. Anyway, so there we were on Sunday night. The event's just getting started. WorldStage is already with the projection system. So where is the projection surface? I'll give you a hint. It is not somewhere that we can project onto it. Well, what was the plan anyway? Step 1, pick up the skull material. The skull was to be built out of 1-inch strips of pine. Why not metal? Well, so that it would burn. Okay. So it was also to be covered, the structure would be covered with Tyvek to give us something to project onto. As a bit of foreshadowing, I will tell you this is the vehicle in which the build team traveled from LA out to the playa. There is no top on this Jeep. Ba-ba-bum. Test pieces were constructed. As you can see here, it seems strong. This is the eye socket, one of the eye sockets to the skull. It's pretty big. That's Joshua Harker standing atop the thing. He had actually built 8-foot tall versions of this skull before, out of basically the same supplies, these same strips of wood. And he reviewed this design with an engineer to make sure that it would be okay in the extreme winds that you would expect out on the playa. It was good for the wind. It was not so good to deal with its own weight, but more on that soon. So what happened? Well, they built a 30-foot tall A-frame so that the skull could be built top down. You build it the top of the thing and then hoist it up a little bit and attach the next piece. It turned out that this A-frame, by their design, was much too big and flimsy. So it started to bow when they started to winch it up with the Jeep. They reinforced it with some donated lumber. Thank you, Costume Cult, for your donated lumber. And they lifted it by crane at night. Then they began construction of the skeleton. As you can see, that's the top of the skull. But about a quarter of the way in, they began to run into problems. You see, the plan for the vertices was that the holes would be drilled in the ends of the wood, eye bolts would be screwed in, and then connected with additional bolts. But as they built the thing, there was extra weight and pull on different parts of the skull, and compression on the 1-inch strips of pine would cause it to bow and then break. Or tension would cause the eye screws to pop right out. These things could be fixed as they went along. This is the jaw of the skull, by the way. As these problems would arise, they could fix the pieces of wood, screw them back in, wire them shut, make it stronger, although over time the issues started to just get worse and worse. Now, the artist assured us that once everything was in place, once the whole thing was constructed, it would be very solid and it would hold its own weight. But unfortunately, it never got to that point. Once it was about 2/3 complete, a single snap of one piece of wood would cascade through all these other failures throughout the skull, and it would set us back by about a day. And this just happened over and over and over again. So pieces kept breaking under the weight of other pieces, and on Thursday morning, about 10 solid days of work behind them, Joshua Harker asked if anyone had a plan B. This is not Josh Harker. This is a guy from the internet. But WorldStage was there, and we proposed a plan B. So we said, well, why don't we just extract the facial features from what has been built and reconstruct just the face. Forget about the top of the head and the back. Just the face, and we'll build it face down, hoist it up to vertical, and then leave it secured to the A-frame. The trouble with this is that the face would be too flimsy without the rest of the skull there to support it. It really needed to match the computer model exactly for the mapping to work right. So we went back to the computer model, we measured dimensions to selected points behind the face, and we added extra edges to create depth and give rigidity to the structure. So with a laptop out there in the desert, in the middle of the day, it was very hard to see, we were there measuring lengths off of the computer model and cutting scraps as needed, re-engineering the thing on the fly. We skinned it with Tyvek while it was in this position, so it would be easier than after it had been set up. Here's a shot from behind. It was a very long 36 hours of Plan B construction. But eventually, we raised the face up. Slid the jaw in underneath, and we finally had our projection surface. We added some bracing under the jaw to hold the weight of the face. I guess I finally put on some pants, too. Meanwhile, the content team and Raul here from my projection team had been building the show timelines in D3, which is our media server and mapping platform. That's D3 Technologies, not to be confused with D3.js. So after midnight on Friday night, we began calibrating the skull, masking out the parts that didn't make it into the final construction. There it is. Given the late state of things, and to get content mapped as quickly as possible, out of 8 projectors that we set up on 4 scaffolding towers, we only calibrated 2 projectors. But it meant getting some of this content up a little sooner for people. So we began projecting content around 4 a.m. on the day of the burn. I actually went the night before to ask for a lift at the artery, and they call in on the radio and they said, hey, we need to get a lift for a deconstruction. And I said, oh, no, we're still going up. And they looked at me like I was crazy. So the structure was strong enough to withstand the whiteout conditions that afternoon before the man burned. And we projected all Saturday night after the man burned. Here is what it looked like.
Oh, yeah, great. I don't want to take that. And we have way more wood now than we started with. Would you add?
The next day, we... Thanks. The next day, we took it down. And we cleaned it up. The original plan had been to burn it on the night after the man burned, but that ended up being the only night that we could project on it, so we didn't burn it. We tore the fucker apart, and then we left. And that was that. So, I want to talk for a few minutes about D3, this platform that we use to do the mapping. D3 was really instrumental in making this happen for us, at least on the intended scale. For 8 projectors, it's the way to go. So first we used it to determine the projector position to ensure, especially to ensure that we got projection coverage inside of the eye sockets. We used it to pre-visualize the way that the projectors would hit the skull. This was an early version of the skull. We had planned to set it on top of a big cube behind it, as you can see here, though that eventually changed. But this is the sort of previs that you can do in D3, which I think is kind of fun and very helpful when you are designing your content. So D3 facilitates a very simple workflow for designing content for this kind of a project. We had Bart Kreza's team in LA did most of the content design for this, although Joshua Harker actually provided a little bit also. This is basically how his content was laid out. This is the UV map that Harker used. This was the UV map. I think this was 3,000 pixels wide that Bart Kreza used. So they would deliver the content that was basically laid out to look like this, and then it gets mapped in 3D onto the skull so that you can see it in the 3D space. So this is actually a rendering from a smaller scale demo of the system that we have set up at the WorldStage lab a couple miles away. You can see that we've placed projectors in the 3D space, and the D3 system then calculates the signal that needs to be output to each projector to make the mapping actually happen. And you can run the video in real time off the visualization, which is pretty cool. This is actually a real demo that we have set up. You can't really see it, but there's the skull and there are two little pico projectors. We use basically the same project file that we used on the Playa. Same content, although I edited it down to about 5 minutes. The real content on the Playa was about 90 minutes long. They spent 700 man-hours generating it. So we knew that on the Playa, as soon as the sun went down, people would be wanting to see the projection as quickly as possible. D3 let us get multiple projectors calibrated simultaneously by different operators, cutting down on the calibration time after sunset. D3 also let us take a live input and map it. So, is this running? That's pretty weird. Let me see if this runs again. There it goes. D3 lets us take a live input. So in addition to rendered video, the content designer had their own outboard system generating graphics, controllable by an iPad, so they could wander around and play along with whatever music happened to be rolling by. This is all generated in real time. There were other solutions for doing this content, this kind of mapping on a skull, besides D3, but D3 has some really great features that we liked in particular. The faster calibration from multiple projectors, guaranteed performance and playback of 4K video at 60 frames per second. And it's extremely robust and provides for some good redundancy. This is our system drawing. There are 4 D3 units in these racks, 1 for control, 2 each with 4 HD outputs for the 8 projectors, and a backup. And it's all routed through a matrix for automatic failover switching. Here's that rack enclosure again. It actually fits 2 rolling racks inside. This is a home-built enclosure from an old project in New York. So, Tempest provided Blizzard projector enclosures for these projectors. They had HEPA filters on the intake. They did not have HEPA filters on the exhaust. And you can see these, you can't really see because of the contrast, but over on the right edge, these are the backs of the enclosures, and they each have 2 vents. These are covered vents, like for your clothing dryer in your house. It closes, but when it's exhausting, it sort of flips open to let the air out. And there are fans in there. This is great for when there is air passing through the enclosure because it blows out through the vents. It is not so great on the dusty, windy Playa when the fans are not on and the wind blows the vents open anyway. And that is what happened. So, hopefully this will be fixed in the next version of these enclosures. The projectors were not destroyed, but they did need a really thorough cleaning inside and out. I'm glad we did not own these projectors. All in all, we learned a lot, and although we couldn't plaster the WorldStage logo and name everywhere, the project did ultimately afford me an opportunity to come here tonight and talk to you. So, yay, WorldStage. Thanks, Dorkbot. Thank you, Gray Area. Thank you for listening.